Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Nathan had been investigating accident scenes and conducting highway patrol operations for 7 years when he received the call that would fundamentally change his understanding of what was possible in this world. He was a man who believed in evidence, in cause and effect, in rational explanations that could be found for any phenomenon if one searched long enough. His training in forensic science had made him a valuable asset to the department. He was frequently called in to assist with complex accident reconstructions and investigations of unusual deaths. But nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, and nothing in the scientific literature he had studied could have prepared him for what he would find on Highway 77 that February night. The call came in at 2:34 in the morning. Several motorists were reporting a vehicle on fire in the southbound lanes, approximately 15 miles north of the Texas border. The initial reports were confusing and contradicted one another. Some callers described seeing fire engulfing a car stopped on the shoulder. Others claimed they had seen a person on fire walking away from a vehicle. One woman, particularly distraught, insisted that she had seen a man burning while standing in the middle of the road. He was not running or rolling on the ground. He was simply walking, as if he were taking a casual stroll. Dispatch classified the incident as a priority emergency, and Nathan was the closest unit to the location. He arrived at the scene 11 minutes after the first call. His patrol car cut through the darkness with its lights flashing and siren wailing. As he approached the reported location, Nathan expected to find the typical aftermath of a vehicle fire. Charred metal, melted plastic, burned rubber, smoke still rising from the wreckage, and possibly an injured or deceased driver who had failed to escape the burning car in time. What he found instead defied all his expectations and violated every principle of fire dynamics he had ever learned. The vehicle was still there. It was a late-model sedan stopped on the shoulder, with the driver's door open. The engine was running, the headlights remained on, and there was absolutely no sign of fire damage. Nathan approached cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon while his mind tried to make sense of the scene. The car appeared completely intact. The paint was not blistered or discolored. The tires were fully inflated. The windows had not cracked from heat exposure. He looked inside the vehicle and found a purse on the passenger seat, a half-empty cup of coffee in the cup holder, and a phone charging in the center console. Everything suggested that the driver had simply pulled over and stepped out for some reason, perhaps to check a tire or stretch his legs during a long drive. But then Nathan saw the footprints. They began beside the driver's side door and continued across the gravel shoulder toward the desert brush that lined the road. They were not ordinary footprints. The gravel and dirt clearly showed the marks of shoe soles, but each impression was surrounded by dark discoloration. Nathan crouched down and touched the ground near one of the footprints with his gloved hand. The soil was still warm. Not merely warm, but hot enough that he could feel the heat through the latex. He shone his flashlight across the area and followed the trail of footprints leading away from the road. About 30 yards from the vehicle, Nathan found the body. The victim was lying face down on the ground, with the arms and legs positioned as if the person had been walking forward and had simply fallen to the ground in the middle of a step. But the condition of the remains made Nathan take an involuntary step back. Only his training prevented him from completely losing his composure. The body was burned beyond recognition, charred to the point that the skin had split open and contracted, exposing muscle tissue and bone underneath. The clothing had been almost completely consumed by fire, leaving only fragments of melted synthetic material on the flesh. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of burned meat and chemicals that made Nathan's eyes fill with tears. What made the scene impossible was the absence of fire damage to anything else. The ground immediately around the body showed no signs of having burned. The vegetation, dry desert grasses and small shrubs that would have ignited instantly if exposed to enough heat, was completely intact. There was no visible accelerant residue in the dirt. There was no evidence of any external ignition source. The body had burned with incredible intensity, hot enough to char bone and melt metal dental fillings. Yet nothing nearby showed any thermal damage. Nathan called for backup, the medical examiner, the fire chief, and the crime scene investigation unit. While he waited for them to arrive, he secured the perimeter and began documenting the scene with photographs and measurements. He examined the vehicle more closely and found the victim's wallet in the glove compartment. The driver's license identified him as Nathan Simmons, a 42-year-old accountant from Nashville, with no criminal record and no history of mental illness or substance abuse. According to the preliminary database check, there was nothing inside the vehicle to suggest a criminal act. No signs of struggle, weapons, drugs, or alcohol. The other units began to arrive, and with them the confusion increased. The fire chief walked the scene twice, took temperature readings, and collected samples before admitting that he had no explanation for what he was seeing. The burn pattern did not match any known type of fire. The intensity of heat required to produce that level of tissue destruction would have ignited everything within a considerable radius. Yet the physical evidence showed that the fire had been confined almost entirely to the victim's body, with minimal spread to the surrounding environment. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment at the scene was even more disturbing. The internal organs showed signs of extreme heat damage, but that damage was not consistent with an external burn. The heart and lungs appeared to have been cooked from the inside, with tissue deterioration suggesting exposure to temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the external burns, though severe, had not penetrated as deeply as would be expected if the fire had started on the outside and moved inward. It was as if the victim had somehow ignited internally, with the fire burning from inside the body outward, rather than coming from an outside source. Investigators combed the area for witnesses and reviewed traffic camera footage along that stretch of road. What they found in the witness statements was consistent, but impossible to reconcile with known science. Several motorists described seeing the victim walking along the shoulder of the road while completely engulfed in flames. They described the fire as bright, with orange and white tones, indicating extreme heat, extending several feet above the victim's head. But what made their accounts so disturbing was the man's behavior. All the witnesses stated that he was not running, not screaming, and not trying to put out the flames. He was walking calmly, deliberately, as if the fire consuming his body did not matter to him at all. One witness, a truck driver with 30 years of experience on the road, provided the most detailed account. He said he was approximately 200 yards behind the sedan when he saw the brake lights come on and the vehicle move onto the shoulder. He watched as the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. The figure stood beside the vehicle for about 10 seconds and then suddenly burst into flames. The truck driver described it as instantaneous, like watching someone flip a light switch. One moment the person was standing normally, the next he was completely engulfed in fire. The burning figure then began walking away from the vehicle, moving at a steady pace along the shoulder and into the desert. The truck driver pulled over and called a 911, but by the time he managed to stop his truck and grab his fire extinguisher, the figure wrapped in flames had already collapsed, and the fire had gone out on its own. The autopsy results only deepened the mystery. The medical examiner confirmed that the victim had died from thermal injuries, but the burn pattern resembled nothing described in forensic literature. The internal organs showed damage consistent with exposure to extreme heat, but there was no evidence of smoke inhalation in the lungs, something that should have been present if the victim had been breathing while burning. The toxicology exam came back negative for accelerants, drugs, alcohol, and any other substance that could explain spontaneous combustion or increased flammability. The victim's stomach contents indicated that he had eaten a normal meal several hours before his death. Nothing strange, nothing concerning. Investigators found no accelerants on the victim's clothing or skin. There were no traces of gasoline, kerosene, lighter fluid, or any other flammable fuel. Chemical analysis of the residue collected from the body showed only the expected byproducts of burning human tissue and synthetic fabric. There was no evidence of an external ignition source. No matches or lighters were found on the body or inside the vehicle. The car lighter had not been activated, and there were no electrical faults that could have produced a spark. The investigation expanded to include the victim's past and his recent activities. Nathan Simmons had no history of mental illness, criminal record, or known enemies. He had been driving back to Nashville after attending a business conference in Dallas. His employer, family, and friends described him as stable, responsible, and completely ordinary. There was nothing in his life to suggest that he could have been involved in anything strange, much less become the victim of an unexplained combustion death on a remote highway. Nathan, the investigating officer, became obsessed with finding an explanation. He spent weeks researching similar cases in the archives, contacting experts in fire science, forensic pathology, and even researchers who had studied alleged cases of spontaneous human combustion. What he found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. There had been documented cases for centuries of people who had died by burning under mysterious circumstances, often with minimal damage to their surroundings. But the scientific community had never accepted spontaneous human combustion as a real phenomenon. Instead, it attributed those cases to external ignition sources that simply had not been identified. However, Nathan found 3 other cases in the department archives that matched the pattern of Nathan Simmons's case almost exactly. In each one, a motorist had stopped their vehicle on a remote stretch of road, stepped out of the car, and been found burned to death a short distance away, with no clear ignition source and minimal environmental damage. The cases had occurred over a period of 15 years, all on different highways in different states, and all remained unsolved. The victims had nothing obvious in common. Different ages, different occupations, different backgrounds. The only things they shared were the manner of death and the total absence of a rational explanation. Nathan compiled all the evidence into an exhaustive case file, but despite his efforts, the case of Nathan Simmons was officially classified as a death by unknown causes. The investigation remained open, but with no suspects, no motive, and no clear mechanism to explain how the death had occurred, there was no other path to follow. The file was sent to storage along with the other 3 similar cases that had preceded it. 17 years have passed since that night, and Nathan still keeps the file on his desk. He has continued investigating similar incidents and has identified 23 cases around the world that fit the same basic pattern. People dying by fire under impossible circumstances, with no ignition source, no accelerants, and minimal damage to the surrounding environment. The medical literature offers no explanation. The fire science community dismisses these cases as anomalies that simply have not been properly investigated. But Nathan knows what he saw. He knows what the evidence showed. And he knows that somewhere between what science can explain and what actually happens in the world, there are phenomena that defy our understanding. The vehicle belonging to Nathan Simmons was eventually released to his family and sold at auction. The stretch of Highway 77 where he died looks exactly the same as it did that night. Just another mile marker on another lonely road. But Nathan drives past that place regularly, and every time he does, he thinks about the footprints leading away from that car, the body that burned with impossible heat, and the witness who saw a man calmly walk through flames that should have made him fall to the ground screaming. Some mysteries are never solved. Some questions have no answers. And sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what happened, but understanding that it could happen again at any moment, to anyone, without warning and without explanation. Story 2. Ryan had been working for the Nevada State Highway Patrol for 11 years when he encountered something that would destroy his understanding of reality and force him to question everything he believed he knew about the world. He was not the kind of officer who believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. He was practical, meticulous, and relied completely on evidence and procedure. His record was spotless. He had received 3 commendations for his service and was being considered for promotion to sergeant. Nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what happened on that freezing January night in 2019. And nothing that came afterward would ever make sense of it. The stretch of Highway 50 that runs through the Nevada desert has earned the nickname the loneliest road in America, and for good reason. In certain sections, a driver can travel more than 100 miles without passing another vehicle or seeing any sign of human presence. The landscape is barren and unforgiving, dominated by sagebrush and rock formations that seem to stretch endlessly in every direction. During the day, the desert sun beats down without mercy. At night, temperatures plummet, and the darkness becomes absolute, interrupted only by the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the void. It was on one of those isolated stretches, approximately 47 miles east of Fallon, that Ryan's patrol shift turned toward the impossible. The dashboard clock read 3:47 in the morning when his headlights illuminated the figure of someone standing on the shoulder of the road. Ryan had been driving for almost 3 hours without seeing another vehicle, and the sudden appearance of a person in such a remote place immediately activated his training. He slowed the patrol car and turned on the spotlight, illuminating the figure more clearly. It was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing what appeared to be a white summer dress, completely inappropriate for the weather. The outside temperature was around 28 degrees, and a sharp wind blew across the desert floor. The woman was waving her arms desperately. It was clear that she was in trouble. Ryan pulled over onto the shoulder and stepped out of his vehicle. He immediately noticed several disturbing details. The woman was barefoot. Her feet were cut and bleeding from walking on the rough asphalt. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin body, and she was trembling violently. What made no sense was the water. According to the weather service, it had not rained in that area in more than 3 weeks, and there were no bodies of water nearby. The woman looked directly at Ryan with eyes wide with terror and began speaking quickly, her words stumbling over one another in panic. She told him her name was Sarah and that she desperately needed help. She said they were following her and that she could not go back. When Ryan asked who was chasing her, she simply shook her head and repeated that he could not take her back there, that it was too horrible, that she would rather die in the desert than return. Ryan tried to calm her using his usual de-escalation techniques, speaking to her in a controlled tone and assuring her that she was safe now. He took an emergency blanket from the trunk and placed it around her shoulders. Then he guided her to the back seat of the patrol car, where the heater was running. As he closed the door and returned to the driver's seat, Ryan radioed dispatch with his location and the situation, requesting that an ambulance meet them in the nearest town. The woman continued speaking from the back seat, and what she said next made Ryan's blood run cold. She gave him specific details about an accident site farther ahead. She described a sedan that had gone off the road approximately 12 miles east, near mile marker 114. She gave the color of the vehicle, dark blue, and said the driver had not survived. She begged Ryan not to take her to that place. Just thinking about it made her increasingly agitated. Ryan made the decision to continue east to verify her story. If there really was an accident ahead, other drivers could be in danger, and someone might need immediate medical attention. He assured the woman that he would not force her to get out of the vehicle, and that she would remain safe inside the patrol car. That seemed to calm her slightly, although she continued looking out the window into the darkness with an expression of deep sadness. 12 miles later, at mile marker 114, Ryan's headlights found exactly what she had described. Fresh skid marks left the road and descended a steep slope into a ravine. At the bottom, a dark blue sedan was overturned, its front end crushed against a large rock. Ryan immediately reported the accident location and requested emergency services. Then he carefully made his way down the slope to check for survivors. The driver was still inside the vehicle, secured by her seatbelt. It was obvious from the first glance that the victim had died on impact. The steering column had been driven into the chest cavity, and the angle of the head indicated a broken neck. Ryan took photographs of the scene and removed the driver's license from the wallet found in the victim's purse. When he looked at the photograph on the license, his hands began to tremble. The face staring back at him from the plastic card was identical to the woman sitting in his patrol car. The same features, the same hair color, the same distinctive scar above the left eyebrow. The name on the license was Sarah Mitchell, 23 years old, with an address in Reno. Ryan climbed back up the slope, his mind racing in search of a rational explanation. Maybe she was her twin sister. Maybe she had been a passenger in the vehicle and had somehow survived the crash. When he reached his patrol car and opened the rear door to ask Sarah about the identification, the back seat was empty. The emergency blanket was folded neatly on the seat, but there was no trace of the woman. Ryan checked around the vehicle, calling her name, but received no answer. The desert stretched silently in every direction, and there was nowhere she could have gone without him seeing her. She had been within the patrol car's field of view the entire time he had spent down in the ravine. The doors had remained closed. He had heard nothing. His radio came to life when dispatch responded to his accident report. They informed him that a missing person report had been filed earlier that night for a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had never arrived at her destination in Ely after leaving Reno. The description of her vehicle matched the sedan in the ravine, and she had been traveling alone. Ryan requested that the coroner and investigation team be sent. Then he sat in his patrol car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That was when he noticed the back seat. Where the woman had been sitting, the upholstery was soaked, and puddles of water had collected on the floor mat. Ryan reached out and touched the water with his fingertips. It was ice cold. He took photographs of the wet seat and the floor. Then he began reviewing the dash cam footage, hoping it would offer some clarity. What he saw in the recording made his stomach sink. The video clearly showed Ryan stopping and getting out of the vehicle. It showed him standing on the shoulder, apparently speaking to someone, although no one was visible in the frame. It showed him taking out the emergency blanket and placing it in the back seat, as if he were wrapping it around invisible shoulders. It showed him driving for 12 miles while apparently conversing with the empty back seat. His head occasionally turned to the right, as if he were listening to a passenger. The audio captured Ryan's voice asking questions and saying reassuring phrases, but no other voice could be heard in the recording. There was no evidence that anyone else had been there. The coroner arrived 90 minutes later and performed a preliminary examination at the scene. Based on body temperature, lividity, and rigor mortis, he estimated that death had occurred approximately 4 hours before Ryan discovered the crash. Sarah Mitchell had died instantly when her vehicle left the road at high speed around midnight. She had been dead for almost 4 hours when Ryan picked up a hitchhiker who looked exactly like her, who was wearing a white dress identical to the one on the body, and who had guided him to the precise location of her own corpse. Ryan remained seated in his patrol car until dawn, watching the investigation team process the scene. He said nothing to the other officers about the hitchhiker. He submitted his report describing the discovery of the accident, but he did not mention how he had known to search that exact location. When he returned to the station at the end of his shift, he asked to review the missing person report filed for Sarah Mitchell. The report had been made by her sister, who explained that Sarah was traveling to Ely to visit friends and that her last contact had been near Fallon. The last known sighting had occurred at a gas station approximately 20 miles west of the point where Ryan had picked up the hitchhiker. Ryan requested and reviewed the security footage from that station. The video showed Sarah buying bottles of water and snacks at 11:23 at night. Then she returned to her vehicle. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the camera captured something that made Ryan's blood turn cold. In the background of the footage, barely visible in the grainy nighttime image, a woman in a white dress could be seen standing beneath a streetlight at the edge of the parking lot. The figure was watching Sarah's vehicle as it drove away. Ryan enhanced the image as much as he could and felt his chest tighten when he realized that the figure was Sarah herself, watching her own car drive away moments before the fatal crash that would end her life. The wet marks in Ryan's patrol car remained for 3 days, despite the heating system running constantly. Crime scene technicians photographed them and collected samples, but they could not find a logical explanation for why they would not evaporate. On the 4th day, they were simply gone. The water had disappeared as mysteriously as the woman. Ryan requested a transfer to desk duty 6 weeks later. He never worked a night shift again. In his request, he cited personal reasons, and the department approved it without question, probably attributing the change to the trauma of finding a dead driver. Ryan never told his supervisors what had really happened that night. He feared they would think he had suffered a psychological breakdown, that the isolation and stress of highway patrol had finally broken him. But he could not dismiss what had happened. The wet seats had been real. The emergency blanket had been moved. The dash cam had recorded him speaking to someone, even though that someone did not appear in the image. and Sarah Mitchell had known exactly where her own body would be found. She had guided him directly to the place of her death. An investigation into the history of Highway 50 revealed a disturbing pattern. Every year on the anniversary of her death, several motorists have reported seeing a young woman in a white dress attempting to stop vehicles near mile marker 102, exactly where Ryan first encountered Sarah. Security footage from the same gas station shows the figure appearing in the background every January 15th, always standing in the same place, always watching the vehicles as they leave. The gas station employee refuses to work the night shift on that date and does not explain why when asked. Sarah Mitchell was buried in a cemetery in Reno. Her death was ruled accidental, the result of overcorrecting the steering wheel while trying to avoid an animal on the road. The toxicology report came back negative for drugs and alcohol. She had simply lost control of her vehicle in a moment of panic and paid for it with her life. There were no indications that anyone else was involved. There was no evidence of a crime. Just a young woman driving alone along the loneliest stretch of road in America, who died frightened and far from home. Ryan keeps a photograph of the wetback seat in his desk drawer. He has shown it to exactly 3 people in the 6 years since that night. 2 dismissed it as condensation or a spilled drink. The third person, an elderly officer who had worked Highway 50 for 30 years before retiring, simply nodded and told Ryan that he was not the first and would not be the last. He told him that some people do not realize they are dead, that they keep trying to get help, keep trying to warn others, keep trying to complete the journey they started. He said Highway 50 has always been that way, and it always will be. Whether Ryan encountered the ghost of Sarah Mitchell or experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and exhaustion remains an open question. What cannot be disputed is that he found her body exactly where an impossible hitchhiker told him to look. That physical evidence of her presence remained for days inside his vehicle, and that his dash cam recorded him interacting with someone who was not there. The loneliest road in America keeps its secrets, and some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Story 3. Lucy had conducted thousands of routine traffic stops during her 8 years with the Tennessee Highway Patrol, and she took pride in her ability to read people. She could detect a nervous driver hiding drugs in the glove compartment, identify a vehicle that had been involved in criminal activity, and pick up on those subtle signals that indicated something was not quite right during an interaction that, in theory, should have been simple. Her instincts had served her well throughout her career, earning recognition from her superiors and respect among her fellow patrol officers. But nothing in her training or experience had prepared her for the traffic stop that would save a life and reveal a horror that still haunts her years later. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, and Interstate 40 was busy with the usual flow of commercial trucks and passenger vehicles crossing rural Tennessee. The weather was clear, the temperature was in the 70s, and visibility was excellent. Lucy had been patrolling since noon, conducting speed enforcement and watching for possible drivers under the influence of alcohol or drugs. At approximately 4:37 in the afternoon, she noticed a silver Honda Accord in the center lane with a broken right taillight. It was a minor violation, the kind that normally ended in a warning rather than a citation, but protocol required her to make the stop to inform the driver about the equipment failure. Lucy activated the patrol car's lights, and the Honda immediately began pulling over, which was the first sign that this stop might not be so routine. Most drivers took several seconds to realize that a patrol car was behind them, often continuing a quarter mile or more before reacting to the lights and siren. This driver responded instantly, almost as if he had been waiting to be stopped. The vehicle came to a complete stop on the shoulder, and Lucy approached on the driver's side after running the license plate through her computer. The registration showed no issues. It belonged to a man named Christopher Hughes with an address in Memphis. As Lucy walked toward the driver's window, she began cataloging the details her training had taught her to observe. The Honda was old, maybe about 15 years old, with visible rust around the wheel wells and a dent in the rear bumper. Nothing unusual. But as she got closer, she noticed that the rear of the vehicle sat lower than the front, as if there was significant weight in the trunk. She also saw at least a dozen air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirror, an excessive amount that immediately triggered an alert in her mind. In her experience, that many air fresheners usually meant someone was trying to hide a smell. The driver already had the window down before Lucy reached the vehicle, and his hands were visible on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He was a white man in his late 30s with thinning brown hair and several days of stubble. His eyes were red and he was sweating, even though the temperature was pleasant. When Lucy asked him for his license and registration, his hands were trembling so badly that he had difficulty getting the documents out of his wallet. Christopher's behavior immediately raised Lucy's level of alertness. She had dealt with nervous drivers before, people who became anxious during any interaction with law enforcement, even when they had done nothing wrong. But this was different. Christopher was not simply nervous. He was terrified. His eyes kept moving toward the rearview mirror. He was not looking at Lucy, but seemed to be checking the back seat and the trunk area. He struggled with his license and dropped it twice before finally handing it over. When Lucy asked him where he was coming from and where he was headed, his story changed 3 times in the span of 30 seconds. First, he said he was returning home to Memphis after a business trip in Nashville. Then he corrected himself and claimed he had been visiting a friend in Knoxville. Finally, he said he was on his way to meet his sister in Jackson. Each version contradicted the previous one, and none made sense considering his current location and the direction in which he was traveling. Lucy asked him to step out of the vehicle, stating that she needed to verify his registration. Christopher's face went pale, and he asked if that was really necessary. When Lucy insisted, he complied, but his movements were jerky, and his breathing had become fast and shallow. As Christopher stood at the rear of his vehicle, Lucy walked casually around the Honda, performing what appeared to be a routine visual inspection. The smell hit her before she reached the trunk. It was a combination of artificial air freshener and something organic being hidden beneath it. She had smelled that mixture before during drug interdiction training. Traffickers often used excessive air fresheners to cover the odor of marijuana or methamphetamine. But there was something else mixed in with that chemical sweetness, something that made her think of sweat, fear, and human waste. Lucy was about to ask Christopher for permission to search the vehicle when she heard it. A faint knock, but unmistakable, coming from the trunk. 3 deliberate knocks. Then a pause, then 3 more. It was not the random sound of cargo shifting during the trip. It was rhythmic, intentional. Someone was inside that trunk, and that person was trying to communicate. Christopher must have seen the realization on Lucy's face, because his entire demeanor changed in an instant. The nervous, clumsy man transformed into something cold and calculating. He took a step toward Lucy, and his right hand moved toward the front pocket of his jacket. Lucy's training took over. She drew her service weapon in one smooth motion, aiming it at the center of Christopher's torso while at the same time pressing her radio with her left hand to request immediate backup. She ordered him to show his hands and get on the ground, her voice cutting through the sound of traffic with absolute authority. For a moment, Christopher seemed to weigh his options. His hand was still inside his jacket pocket, and Lucy could see his jaw tighten as he calculated whether he could reach whatever he was going for before she fired. The instant stretched impossibly long. Traffic sped past on the interstate. The sun was beginning to descend in the western sky, and 2 people remained locked in a confrontation that could end in violence in the space of a heartbeat. Then Christopher made his decision. Instead of obeying Lucy's orders, he turned and ran. He sprinted across the highway shoulder, jumped the guardrail, and disappeared into the dense vegetation bordering the interstate. Lucy had to decide in a fraction of a second. She could chase him on foot, leaving the vehicle and whoever was inside the trunk unattended. Or she could secure the scene and ensure the safety of the possible victim. She chose the second option. She ran to her patrol car, grabbed her baton, and returned to the Honda. She shouted that she was a police officer and that she was going to open the trunk. Then she used the baton to break the driver's side window and activate the trunk release lever. The lid rose slowly, and what Lucy saw inside would remain burned into her memory forever. A young woman lay curled in the fetal position, her wrists bound behind her back with plastic zip ties and her ankles restrained in the same way. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth, and her eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion. She was wearing a university sweatshirt and jeans, both dirty and torn. Her face was covered in bruises, one eye almost completely closed from swelling, and dried blood was stuck along her hairline, where she had apparently been struck on the head. When she saw Lucy's uniform, she began to sob, her entire body shaking with the release of the terrible fear she had been holding in. Lucy immediately called for an ambulance and additional units. Then she carefully removed the duct tape from the young woman's mouth and used her knife to cut the zip ties. The girl could barely speak. Her throat was raw from screaming, crying, or both. She managed to whisper that her name was Penelope, that she was 17 years old, and that she had been in that trunk for what felt like forever. Lucy wrapped her in a patrol blanket and tried to keep her calm while they waited for the ambulance. She asked Penelope if she could tell her what had happened, but the girl simply shook her head and continued crying. Backup arrived in 7 minutes, although to Lucy it felt like an eternity. 2 additional patrol cars and a sheriff's deputy converged on the scene, and a coordinated search for Christopher immediately began. A K-9 unit was sent to track his scent from the point where he had entered the woods. The ambulance arrived moments later, and paramedics began treating Penelope for dehydration and shock. She was conscious but disoriented, and the paramedics determined that she needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. Before the ambulance left, Lucy asked Penelope one crucial question. How long had she been in the trunk? Penelope's answer made Lucy feel physically sick. 47 hours. The young woman had been locked in that trunk for almost 2 full days, unable to stretch her legs or use a bathroom, receiving a minimal amount of water and no food, breathing exhaust fumes and enduring suffocating heat. She had been abducted from the parking lot of a college campus in Arkansas 3 days earlier and transported across several states inside the trunk of that Honda, completely helpless and convinced she was going to die. As the ambulance took Penelope to the nearest trauma center, Lucy and her colleagues processed the Honda as a crime scene. What they found in that vehicle painted the portrait of premeditated evil that went far beyond a single abduction. In the glove compartment, they discovered a handwritten list with names, physical descriptions, and locations. Penelope's name was on that list along with 8 others. Some names had check marks beside them. In the back seat, hidden under a blanket, they found more plastic zip ties, duct tape, rope, and a package of plastic sheeting. In the front seat console, they found a folding knife with dried blood on the blade and a detailed handwritten plan describing what Christopher intended to do with Penelope once he reached his destination. The plan described a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains where Christopher would take his victims. It described the soundproof room he had built in the basement. It described the tools he had gathered and the schedule he intended to follow. As Lucy read those pages, she understood with absolute clarity that if she had not made that traffic stop, if she had not heard the knocks from the trunk, Penelope would have disappeared into those mountains and would never have been seen alive again. The search for Christopher intensified as detectives began investigating the names on his list. 2 of them were identified as missing persons cases from the previous year. One was a 21-year-old college student who had disappeared from a rest area in Arkansas. The other was a 19-year-old waitress who had disappeared from the parking lot of a grocery store in Kentucky. Both cases had gone cold with no suspects and no leads. Now investigators had reason to believe that Christopher had been responsible for both abductions, and possibly others. Christopher was captured 6 hours later while trying to hitchhike on a rural road 30 miles from the place where he had fled. He was not armed at the time of his arrest, but when officers searched the jacket he was wearing, they found what he had been trying to reach during his confrontation with Lucy. It was a 9mm Glock pistol with a round in the chamber and the safety off. If Lucy had hesitated for even an instant, if her training had not taken control, Christopher would have shot her and disappeared with Penelope still trapped in that trunk. During the interrogation, Christopher initially refused to speak, but eventually his attorney negotiated a deal. In exchange for revealing the locations of his other victims, he would avoid the death penalty. He led investigators to a shallow grave in the Smoky Mountains. where they recovered the body of the missing college student. He also provided detailed information about the waitress, whose remains were found at another location in eastern Kentucky. He confessed to abducting 4 women over a period of 3 years, although he claimed that Penelope was the only one he had intended to keep alive for an extended period. The others had died within days of their abductions. Penelope spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from dehydration, malnutrition, and her physical injuries. The psychological trauma would take much longer to heal. She underwent months of therapy and eventually testified at Christopher's trial, describing in vivid detail the 47 hours she spent inside that trunk. She described how she heard him stop to buy gas and food, how she heard him make phone calls to friends and family as if nothing were happening, and how she wondered whether each moment would be her last. Christopher was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and assault. During sentencing, he showed no remorse and offered no explanation for his actions beyond saying that he wanted to see how long he could keep a person alive in captivity. The judge called him a predator without a conscience and expressed relief that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. Lucy received a commendation for her actions during the traffic stop, and her quick thinking was recognized as the reason Penelope was still alive, and several unresolved cases were able to be closed. But that recognition meant little to her compared to the weight of what she almost missed. She thinks constantly about that day, about the broken taillight that gave her justification to stop the vehicle, about the excessive number of air fresheners that raised her suspicions, about the knocks coming from the trunk, which for an instant she almost dismissed as simple cargo shifting. She thinks about the 2 women whose bodies were recovered from those mountains, and wonders how many times other officers might have stopped Christopher's vehicle during his 3 years of criminal activity. How many times he might have been pulled over for minor violations and allowed to continue on his way with a victim dying in the trunk. The Honda was eventually destroyed, but Lucy kept a photograph of the vehicle in her locker. She looks at it before every shift as a reminder that routine traffic stops are never truly routine. That evil often hides behind nervous smiles and broken taillights, and that the difference between life and death can depend on one officer trusting her instincts and refusing to ignore the warning signs. Penelope is alive today because Lucy heard those knocks and understood what they meant. 2 families were able to bury their daughters and find at least some measure of closure because Lucy made that stop and refused to let Christopher keep driving. But Lucy still sometimes wakes in the middle of the night, hearing those rhythmic knocks in her dreams, wondering how many other trunks are still traveling the highways of America with victims who will never be found in time. Story 4. Sergeant Stella had been part of the Tennessee Highway Patrol's Tactical Support Division for 9 years. During that time, she had participated in dozens of high-risk operations, drug raids, fugitive apprehensions, weapon seizures, and human trafficking investigations had been a regular part of her responsibilities. She had seen the worst of what human beings could do to one another. She had witnessed scenes of violence and degradation that would have haunted most civilians for the rest of their lives. But nothing in her extensive experience could have prepared her for what waited inside the old roadside rest stop that had been converted into something else, abandoned beside Interstate 24, or for the betrayal that would shake her faith in law enforcement to its core. The investigation had begun 3 months earlier with an anonymous call made to the FBI human trafficking hotline. The caller, whose voice was distorted and whose number was impossible to trace, provided specific information about suspicious activity at a property that had once been a highway rest area but had been sold to private owners years earlier. The caller described vehicles arriving at strange hours, always with covered windows or sealed cargo areas. They also mentioned seeing women and girls being moved from the vehicles into the building and hearing screams coming from inside the structure at night. In addition, the caller claimed that some of the vehicles involved had been modified to look like police cruisers. The FBI took the report seriously enough to begin surveillance of the location. What they observed over the following weeks confirmed many of the anonymous caller's claims. Thermal imaging showed approximately 17 people inside the building during nighttime hours. with unusual movement patterns suggesting that some occupants were confined to specific areas. License plate readers captured data from the vehicles entering and leaving the property. When those plates were checked against national databases, several appeared linked to missing persons cases in different states. 3 of the vehicles that frequently visited the location were registered to individuals with prior convictions for human trafficking and sexual assault. The decision was made to execute a coordinated raid on the property. The operation would include the FBI, the Tennessee Highway Patrol Tactical Team, the DEA due to suspected drug involvement, and the local county sheriff's department. Stella was assigned to the entry team, one of 12 agents responsible for breaching the building and securing any suspects found inside. The planning phase lasted 2 weeks, with detailed reconnaissance of the property, acquisition of the necessary warrants, and coordination among the multiple participating agencies. The raid was scheduled for before dawn on a Tuesday morning, with the intention of catching the occupants at their most vulnerable moment and reducing the risk of armed resistance. The tactical teams gathered at a staging area 5 miles from the target at 4:30 in the morning. Stella checked her gear methodically, as she had done before every operation. Bulletproof vest, helmet, flashbangs, restraint ties, medical kit, and her service weapon loaded with a full magazine and 1 round in the chamber. The briefing was thorough. They expected to encounter armed suspects. They knew there were possible victims inside who would need immediate medical attention. They were prepared to discover a drug manufacturing lab or a trafficking transit station, where victims were temporarily held before being moved elsewhere. But they were not prepared for the scale of what they were about to find. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles moved into position at 5:47 in the morning, surrounding the property and blocking every possible escape route. The entry teams approached from multiple angles, moving quickly and silently through the darkness before dawn. At the given signal, they breached simultaneously through 3 different access points, using battering rams to force open doors that had been reinforced with additional locks and security bars. Stella entered through the main entrance with her team, moving room by room with weapons raised and issuing commands to any occupants they encountered. The first horror was revealed in what had once been the public restroom area of the rest stop. The space had been transformed into a series of improvised cells, with walls built from plywood and 2x4 beams dividing the area into narrow compartments, barely large enough for a person to lie down. Each cell was secured with a padlock on the outside, and several still contained occupants. Inside those cells, they found women and girls between the ages of 14 and 32. Some were lying on bare mattresses. Others were curled in corners. Their physical conditions varied, but all showed signs of prolonged captivity, malnutrition, bruises, untreated wounds, and that empty stare associated with severe psychological trauma. Stella's team immediately shifted from tactical mode to rescue mode, requesting medical assistance and carefully removing the victims from the cells. The women were terrified. Some screamed at the sight of the armed agents. Others remained completely catatonic, responding to nothing. Stella removed her helmet and bulletproof vest to appear less intimidating as she helped a young girl, who could not have been more than 15 years old, out of one of the cells. The girl wore clothes too large for her thin body, and her wrists showed the marks of restraints that had been removed recently. As medical personnel began arriving to treat the victims, other members of the tactical team continued clearing the building. In what had once been the main lobby of the rest area, they discovered an office containing the operational core of the trafficking network. There were filing cabinets filled with detailed transaction records, photographs of victims in different stages of captivity, and computer equipment storing databases with information about buyers and sellers within a network that extended across 6 states. The level of organization was sophisticated, indicating that this was not a small operation, but rather one point within a much larger criminal enterprise. The man who appeared to be the leader of the operation, a 47-year-old man named Christian, was found trying to destroy hard drives when the tactical team entered the office. He was arrested while claiming that the property was a religious sanctuary and that law enforcement had no jurisdiction over his activities. His protests were ignored as he was handcuffed and removed from the building. 13 other suspects were detained at different points across the property. Some were trying to escape through rear exits. Others were attempting to hide in crawl spaces and storage areas. But the true horror of the compound was revealed when investigators discovered the underground expansion. Beneath the main building, accessible through a hidden entrance in what had once been the maintenance room, there was a series of rooms excavated and built without permits or any official knowledge. Those underground chambers showed evidence of torture, restraints bolted to the walls, bloodstains on the concrete floors, and instruments designed to cause pain and exert control through fear. The psychological impact of seeing those rooms affected even the most experienced officers present at the scene. Several had to step outside to compose themselves before they could continue with the investigation. As the victims were transported to hospitals and crisis centers, they began giving testimony about their suffering. The stories they told painted a portrait of systematic predation that had been operating for years. Women traveling alone on the interstate had been targeted by individuals wearing authentic highway patrol uniforms and driving vehicles that looked identical to official patrol cars. These fake officers initiated traffic stops for minor violations, then used their apparent authority to gain compliance before abducting their victims. Other victims had been captured at rest areas, gas stations, and truck stops along major highways. They were approached by men who claimed to be law enforcement officers investigating criminal activity. The investigation into how the trafficking network had obtained authentic uniforms and equipment led to a discovery that devastated the law enforcement community. 3 of the 14 suspects arrested at the compound were real highway patrol officers. They had used their positions and authority to facilitate abductions, provided information about patrol schedules and checkpoint locations to help the operation avoid detection, and actively participated in the trafficking activities. The revelation that sworn officers who were meant to protect and serve had actually been predators using their badges to hunt victims sent shockwaves through every department involved in the case. The scope of the operation became clearer as forensic analysts reviewed the seized computers and documents. The trafficking network had been operating for at least 6 years. It had connections to similar operations in 11 other states and had moved an estimated 200 victims through its network during that time. Some victims had been sold to buyers overseas. Others had been kept in domestic situations of forced labor or sexual slavery. A significant number had simply disappeared, and their final fates were unknown and would likely never be determined. The trial against the suspects from the compound took 8 months to complete. The evidence was overwhelming. Victim testimony, physical evidence found at the location, and digital records documenting years of criminal activity. 7 of the defendants received life sentences without the possibility of parole. The 3 highway patrol officers who had been part of the operation received aggravated sentences due to their abuse of authority and betrayal of public trust. Their cases received widespread media coverage, leading to nationwide reforms in how law enforcement agencies conduct background checks and monitor officer behavior for signs of corruption. For the 8 women and girls rescued from the compound, the road to recovery would be long and difficult. They were placed in witness protection programs due to fear of retaliation from other members of the trafficking network who remained at large. They received extensive medical treatment and psychological support, but the trauma of what they had endured would remain with them for the rest of their lives. 2 of the youngest victims could not remember their real names or where they came from, after being held captive for so long that their former lives had been erased from memory. Stella needed 2 years of therapy before she felt capable of fully returning to duty. The images of those cells, the condition of the victims, and especially the knowledge that fellow officers had been responsible, haunted her dreams and made it difficult for her to trust her colleagues. She transferred to another division, unable to continue working alongside officers she had known for years, without wondering whether they too might be capable of such a betrayal. The raid on the compound had saved 8 lives and dismantled a major trafficking operation. But it had also revealed that evil can wear a badge and use the authority of law enforcement to prey on the vulnerable. And that knowledge, once learned, could never be forgotten. Story 5. Trooper Landon had heard the stories from veteran officers about the fog walker since his first week with the West Virginia Highway Patrol, and he had completely dismissed them as some kind of initiation ritual that new recruits were put through in every department. The older officers would gather in the break room during shift changes and speak in low voices about the thing that appeared in the fog along Route 12 in the Appalachian Mountains. They said it caused accidents, that some drivers were found catatonic behind the wheel, with no memory of what had happened to them. They described a figure of impossible height, with movements that were not entirely human, something that should not exist, but that, according to them, had been seen by dozens of officers over the decades. Landon laughed along with the other rookies, convinced it was nothing more than an urban legend created to unsettle the newcomers who would have to patrol those isolated mountain roads alone at night. His first encounter with the fog walker occurred 11 months after he began his career, on a November night when a dense fog warning had been issued for the entire mountain region. Visibility on Route 12 had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the Highway Patrol was recommending that drivers avoid the area if possible, or drastically reduce speed if travel was necessary. Landon had been assigned to patrol the stretch of road between mile markers 87 and 115, a 28-mile section of winding mountain road that was dangerous even in good weather. The fog transformed it into something far more threatening, a gray void where the road seemed to vanish just beyond the reach of the headlights. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, Landon's headlights caught movement in the fog ahead of him. He slowed the patrol car until it was moving almost at a crawl, assuming it was a deer, or maybe a driver whose vehicle had broken down and who was walking along the shoulder. As he drew closer, the silhouette began to take shape until it resembled a person standing directly in the center of the northbound lane. Landon turned on the spotlight and emergency lights, trying to illuminate the figure as clearly as possible through the thick fog. What he saw made no sense. The figure was absurdly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet in height, with proportions that were subtly wrong in a way Landon's brain struggled to process. The limbs were too long in relation to the torso. The head rested at an angle that suggested the neck was broken, or that it had simply been built differently from human anatomy. The figure appeared to be wearing dark clothing, though the fog made it difficult to distinguish specific details. It remained completely motionless in the road, not reacting to the lights or the approaching patrol car. Landon brought the vehicle to a complete stop about 30 feet away and activated the loudspeaker, ordering the person to move to the shoulder. There was no response. The figure remained still, and the fog swirled around it in patterns that seemed to avoid direct contact with its body. Landon radioed dispatch with his location and the situation. Then he got out of the patrol car with his flashlight in hand. He took 3 steps toward the figure, and in the time it took him to blink, it disappeared. It simply vanished. There was no movement. There was no sound. Only empty fog where moments earlier something had been standing. Landon searched the immediate area with his flashlight, checking both sides of the road and looking for any sign of where the figure could have gone. The fog was so dense that visibility reached only a few feet in any direction, but there was nowhere something that large could hide on an open road. Even more disturbing was the complete absence of footprints on the wet pavement. The fog had left a thin layer of condensation on the road surface, which should have shown marks if someone had been walking there, but the asphalt was untouched. Before Landon could return to his patrol car, dispatch called him to report an accident approximately 2 miles ahead, near mile marker 91. It was a single vehicle collision, with the driver reported as unconscious or unresponsive. Landon responded immediately, moving at reduced speed through the fog-covered curves until he reached the crash site. A sedan had left the road and struck a guardrail at low speed, causing minimal damage to the vehicle but leaving the driver in a deeply disturbing state. The driver was a man in his early 40s. According to the preliminary assessment, he had no physical injuries, but he was completely catatonic. His eyes were open and dilated, fixed straight ahead through the windshield, staring at nothing. He did not respond to verbal commands, did not react when light was shown into his eyes, and showed no awareness of Landon's presence. His hands remained gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, and his fingers had to be loosened one by one. An ambulance transported him to the nearest hospital, where medical examinations found no physical injuries, no drugs or alcohol in his system, and no neurological explanation for his condition. Landon filed his report on both incidents, carefully documenting the strange figure in the road and its impossible disappearance. He expected his supervisor to question the account or suggest that the fog had played tricks on his perception. Instead, his supervisor pulled a thick file from a locked cabinet and placed it on the desk between them. The file contained reports going back 43 years, all describing similar encounters on Route 12 during fog events. There were 17 separate incidents in which drivers had been found in a catatonic state after accidents. There were also 22 reports from highway patrol officers describing a tall figure appearing in the fog and disappearing without explanation. There were 4 cases in which vehicle passengers claimed to have seen the figure approaching before the driver became paralyzed and the vehicle lost control. The pattern was undeniable. All the incidents occurred during dense fog conditions. Every sighting described the same impossible height and the same incorrect proportions. Every affected driver displayed the same symptoms of extreme psychological trauma, with no identifiable physical cause. The local historical society had records of similar incidents going back even farther, with accounts from the 1940s describing drivers who claimed to have seen something in the fog that should not exist. Something that watched them from the side of the road with eyes that reflected light like those of an animal. One particularly detailed testimony from 1967 came from a state trooper who had been monitoring Route 12 during a fog event and had seen the figure approach his stopped patrol car. He described a face pressing against the driver's side window with features that were almost human, but with too many teeth visible in what may have been a smile, or perhaps something else entirely. The trooper became paralyzed, unable to move or call for help, while the figure remained beside the window for what felt like hours, though it was later determined to have been approximately 3 minutes based on radio timestamps. When the fog finally lifted enough for other units to reach his location, they found him unresponsive behind the wheel. He never returned to active duty. Landon's second encounter with the fog walker occurred 7 months later during another episode of heavy fog on Route 12. This time he was responding to a disabled vehicle near mile marker 94, where a driver had called requesting assistance for a flat tire. As Landon approached the location, his headlights caught the same impossible figure standing on the shoulder of the road. This time it was much closer to his vehicle. He could distinguish more details through the fog. The way the figure's movements were jerky and unnatural when it turned to look toward the patrol car. The way its head tilted at an angle that should have been anatomically impossible. The way it began walking toward the patrol car with a gait that suggested joints bending in the wrong directions. Landon's training and instinct collided with a primitive terror he had never felt before. He knew he should get out of the vehicle and investigate. He knew he should report the sighting and wait for backup. But his body refused to obey his commands. His hands gripped the steering wheel exactly as he had found the catatonic driver gripping his months earlier. He watched in horror as the figure approached, growing larger as it moved through the fog with motions that hurt to look at. When it reached the passenger side of the patrol car, it pressed what appeared to be a face against the window. Landon could see teeth, too many teeth, arranged in rows that extended backward into a throat that seemed to contain a darkness deeper than the fog outside. He could see eyes reflecting the patrol car's interior lights with a greenish glow that no human eye should produce. He could see the condensation of its breath fogging the window, even though he logically knew that whatever that thing was, it should not breathe in any way he could understand. The moment stretched impossibly long. Then the figure pulled away from the window and disappeared into the fog. When backup arrived 15 minutes later, they found Landon sitting in his patrol car, conscious but unable to speak coherently. The disabled vehicle he had supposedly been responding to was nowhere to be found, and no record of an assistance call was found in dispatch logs. Landon was transported to the hospital, where he was evaluated and discharged without physical injuries. The next day, he requested a transfer to another patrol region, and his request was approved without question. In the 8 years since that encounter, Landon has never returned to Route 12. He has spoken with 4 other officers who had similar experiences, and all of them transferred or retired rather than continue patrolling that stretch of road. The incidents continue at a rate of approximately 2 per year, always during fog conditions, always with the same impossible figure and the same traumatized witnesses. No satisfactory explanation has ever been found. No clear photograph has ever been obtained, despite the dashboard cameras installed in modern patrol cars. The figure appears and disappears according to patterns no one has been able to predict or prevent. And drivers continue reporting that they have seen something in the fog along Route 12, something that should not exist, something that has been there for decades and shows no signs of stopping. Story 6. Officer Audrey had been working with the Colorado Highway Patrol for 4 years when she made the traffic stop that would become the most disturbing case of her entire career. Among her colleagues, she had earned a reputation for having excellent instincts, an almost special ability to sense when something was wrong, even when everything appeared normal at first glance. Her instructors had noticed that quality from the beginning of her training, and over time it had helped her identify drivers under the influence, locate hidden weapons, and detect deception during interactions that seemed routine on the surface. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would find inside the blue minivan, with the expired license plate that she stopped on a sunny Wednesday afternoon in June. The van caught her attention during a routine license plate scan while she was conducting speed enforcement on Interstate 70 near the mountain town of Silverthorne. The automatic system flagged the vehicle because its registration had expired 3 months earlier. It was a minor violation, the kind that normally ended in a warning or a small fine. Audrey turned on the patrol car's lights, and the minivan immediately pulled over onto the shoulder, complying with all the usual procedures. Nothing about the stop seemed strange as she approached the vehicle. It was an ordinary family minivan, maybe about 10 years old, but well maintained, with no visible damage or suspicious modifications. As Audrey walked toward the driver's side window, she performed her standard visual assessment of the vehicle and its occupants. The driver was a woman in her late 40s or early 50s named Leah, with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail and dressed in casual clothing. In the back seat were 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy, who appeared to be between approximately 4 and 9 years old. All of them were properly buckled into their seats, and there were no obvious safety violations. But when Audrey moved closer to the window, she noticed something that triggered her instincts in a way she could not immediately explain. The children were completely silent. It was not the normal silence of well-behaved children during a traffic stop. It was an unnatural stillness, an immobility that felt wrong. They sat without moving, without looking around, without even seeming to breathe. Their eyes were open but unfocused, fixed straight ahead, staring at the backs of the front seats. Audrey had seen thousands of children during traffic stops over the years, and she had never observed minors so still. Even the most disciplined children shifted a little, looked around, or showed some sign of being aware of what was happening. These children looked like mannequins. The driver rolled down the window before Audrey reached her, smiling too much and speaking too quickly. She apologized repeatedly for the expired registration, explaining that she had meant to renew it but had been busy with the children and their activities. Her explanation was far too detailed for such a minor violation, offering information Audrey had not asked for about where they had been and where they were going. Audrey's instincts, already on alert because of the children's strange behavior, became more insistent. Something was very wrong with the situation. There was also a smell. It was faint but distinctive, a chemical scent that reminded her of hospital antiseptics, mixed with something else she could not immediately identify. When she asked the driver about it, Leah's smile became even wider and more forced as she claimed she had spilled some cleaning products earlier that day. The explanation was plausible, but the way she said it felt rehearsed, as if Leah had been prepared for that specific question. Audrey asked for her driver's license and the vehicle registration, the standard procedure in any traffic stop. While Leah searched through the glove compartment for the documents, Audrey took the opportunity to observe the children more carefully. The boy sitting in the middle seat had visible dark circles under his eyes, and his skin had an unhealthy paleness that suggested illness or severe sleep deprivation. The youngest girl's clothes were dirty and appeared to be several sizes too large for her thin body. The older girl had what looked like bruises around her wrists, marks that could have been caused by restraints. When Audrey asked the children their names, Leah answered for them before any of them could respond. She said the names quickly and confidently, but the children did not react when they heard what were supposedly their own names. There was no recognition, no eye contact, nothing. Audrey asked them directly if they were okay. Once again, Leah intervened before they could answer, saying they were tired after a long day of activities and just wanted to get home. The children remained completely silent and motionless. Audrey's training and instincts were screaming at her that this was not a normal traffic stop. She requested backup using a code that would alert other units to respond without letting the driver know she had asked for assistance. She kept her demeanor calm and professional, not wanting to escalate the situation before help arrived, but positioned herself so she could react quickly if Leah tried to flee or became aggressive. The license check confirmed that Leah had a valid document and an address in Denver, about 70 miles from their current location. But when Audrey asked where they were headed, Leah claimed they were going back home to Grand Junction, which was in the opposite direction. When Audrey pointed out the inconsistency, Leah became visibly unsettled for the first time. Her smile faltered as she corrected herself and said she had made a mistake because she was tired. Then she said they were visiting relatives in Vail, but that also did not match their current location or the direction in which they were traveling. The backup unit arrived in 8 minutes, and Audrey's partner approached the passenger side of the minivan while she maintained her position by the driver's window. With another officer present, Audrey felt more secure pressing the situation a little further. She asked Leah to step out of the vehicle so they could discuss the expired registration and verify the insurance information. Leah's attitude changed immediately. The forced smile disappeared and was replaced by visible anxiety and resistance. She said there was no need for her to get out of the vehicle, that she could provide all the necessary information from the driver's seat. Audrey insisted. When Leah continued resisting, Audrey made the decision to physically remove her from the vehicle for officer safety. As Leah was escorted toward the patrol car, she began to grow increasingly agitated. She said the children needed to get home, that they had medication schedules to follow, that this was unnecessary harassment. Her protests were loud enough to be heard clearly, but the children inside the minivan still did not react. They remained motionless in their seats, staring straight ahead. With Leah secured in the patrol car, Audrey's partner opened the minivan's sliding door to check on the children's welfare. What they discovered confirmed Audrey's worst suspicions. The children were heavily sedated. Their pupils were constricted and their responses to stimuli were minimal. Under the front seats, they found empty prescription medication bottles, along with plastic zip ties that had been cut but not discarded. Beneath the removable floor mats in the cargo area were more restraints, rolls of duct tape, and a large plastic container that appeared to have been recently cleaned, although it still contained residue that would later be identified as human waste. Medical personnel were called immediately, and the children were transported to the nearest hospital for evaluation and treatment. The initial medical evaluation revealed that all three had been subjected to prolonged sedation using prescription medication, probably for several days or even longer. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and showed physical signs of restraint injuries on their wrists and ankles. The youngest boy also had injuries consistent with having been confined in a small space for extended periods. The subsequent investigation revealed a nightmare that had been unfolding for 18 months. The children had been abducted in 3 different states, in separate incidents. None of them was related to Leah or to one another. Leah had been moving from state to state in the minivan, keeping the children sedated and restrained, living inside a delusional fantasy in which she believed she was rescuing them from bad families and taking them toward a better life. She had developed an elaborate system for controlling the children, with detailed schedules for administering medication, feeding them, and allowing them to use the bathroom, all designed to minimize the time they spent conscious and capable of resisting. The forensic examination of the minivan and Leah's belongings uncovered journals filled with detailed observations about families she had been watching. She spent months observing playgrounds, schools, and public spaces, selecting children whom she believed were being neglected or mistreated by their parents. Her selection criteria were based entirely on delusional interpretations of normal parent-child interactions. To Leah, a parent looking at a phone while their child played was evidence of neglect. A parent telling a child to hurry up or be quiet was proof of abuse. She had convinced herself that she was performing a noble act by abducting those children. A deeper investigation revealed that the 3 minors found in the minivan were not Leah's only victims. Evidence in her journals referred to 4 other children who had previously been in her custody. Expanded searches in areas where Leah had traveled led to the devastating discovery of the bodies of 2 children, victims who had not survived the heavy sedation and confinement. 2 other children mentioned in the journals were never found, and it remains unknown whether they are still alive somewhere or whether their bodies simply have not been discovered. Leah's psychological evaluation revealed a severe delusional disorder with paranoid features. She truly believed she was protecting the children, that she was the only person who genuinely cared about their well-being, and that the families she had taken them from were monsters who deserved to lose their children. Even when confronted with the evidence of the harm she had caused, including the deaths of 2 children, she remained convinced that her actions had been justified and necessary. The 3 children rescued from the minivan faced long and difficult recoveries. Prolonged exposure to sedative medication had caused developmental delays and possible long-term neurological effects. The psychological trauma of their experiences would require years of therapy. Most heartbreaking of all, 2 of the 3 children had spent so much time in Leah's custody that, when reunited with their biological parents, they initially did not recognize them. The prolonged sedation and isolation had effectively erased their memories of their previous lives, forcing them to go through a difficult process of rebuilding bonds with families they no longer remembered. For Audrey, the case became a defining moment in her career. She thought constantly about the timing of everything, about the automatic license plate reader that had flagged that exact minivan on that exact day. If Leah had renewed the registration, if Audrey had been assigned to another patrol route, if she had ignored her instincts about those motionless children, those 3 minors would have remained in Leah's custody. They could have ended up like the 2 children whose bodies were found, or like the other 2 who never appeared. Audrey became an active advocate for better training in recognizing human trafficking and child abduction situations. She developed training materials based on her experience, emphasizing the importance of trusting officers' instincts when something feels wrong, even if specific violations cannot be identified immediately. She also worked with child advocacy groups to improve missing child tracking systems and coordination of information between different jurisdictions. The blue minivan was eventually destroyed after all forensic evidence had been collected, but Audrey keeps a photograph of it in her locker. Before every shift, she looks at that image and reminds herself why the work matters, why every traffic stop deserves full attention and proper procedure, and why trusting her instincts can mean the difference between life and death for the vulnerable people she swore to protect. Story 7. The dispatch operator supervising the night shift had spent 12 years routing calls for the New Mexico Highway Patrol, and she took pride in staying calm even in the most tense situations. She had guided officers through high-speed pursuits, coordinated responses to multi-vehicle accidents, and kept her composure while listening to agents request backup during violent confrontations. Her voice over the radio was always steady, professional, and reassuring. But Officer Christian's final transmission that February night would break through her professional distance and haunt her for the rest of her life. Christian had been with the Highway Patrol for 6 years and was known among his colleagues as a reliable and sensible officer. He worked alone on the night shift, covering a remote section of Highway 84 that crossed the New Mexico desert between the towns of Las Vegas and Santa Rosa. It was lonely work, with nights when hours passed between one vehicle and the next, but Christian had never complained. He followed protocol meticulously, checking in with the dispatch every 30 minutes as required and responding quickly to any call within his area. His last routine report came in at 11:47 at night. The transmission was clear and professional. He reported that everything was quiet at mile marker 247. The dispatcher acknowledged the report and noted the time in her log. Nothing about that communication suggested anything unusual. Christian sounded calm, alert, and completely in control. 30 minutes later, when he did not make his scheduled 12:17 a.m. check-in, the dispatcher attempted to contact him by radio. There was no response. She tried again, using both his unit number and his name, but received only static. At 12:19 a.m., Christian's voice suddenly came over the radio. The transmission was distorted, broken by interference that should not have occurred considering the quality of the patrol's communication equipment. Through the static, the dispatcher heard Christian say, "There are too many of them." The phrase made no sense. Christian was in a remote area of the desert, and dispatch had not sent him to any call. There should not have been anyone there, much less too many of something or someone. The dispatcher immediately asked for clarification, requesting that Christian repeat the transmission and specify what he meant. His response came through more clearly this time, and the words sent a chill through the dispatch center. "They shouldn't be here. This is wrong." His voice had changed. The calm professionalism was gone, replaced by something that sounded like confusion mixed with awe. He was not panicking, but there was something clearly wrong in his tone. The dispatcher asked for his exact location and status, trying to determine whether he needed backup. In the background of the transmission, she could hear sounds she could not identify. The vehicle door opening, footsteps on gravel, and Christian's breathing becoming heavier, as if he were exerting himself physically. Then his voice came through again, and this time there was an unmistakable note of wonder in his words. "Tell my wife I saw something beautiful and terrible. They're taking me to..." The transmission cut off abruptly in the middle of the sentence. The dispatcher immediately activated emergency protocol, broadcasting an officer in distress alert and sending every available unit to Christian's last known location at mile marker 247. She continued trying to reach Christian by radio while coordinating the response at the same time. The nearest backup unit was 43 minutes away because of how isolated the location was. A state police helicopter was dispatched, but it would take more than an hour to reach the area. The dispatcher kept calling Christian's radio every 30 seconds, hoping for a response that never came. The first unit arrived at the scene at 12:59 a.m., 40 minutes after Christian's last transmission. What they found defied all explanation. Christian's patrol car was parked on the shoulder of the road exactly at mile marker 247. The engine was still running, the lights remained on, and the driver's door was wide open. There was no sign of Christian. There were no signs of other vehicles. There was no indication of what had caused him to leave his patrol car or where he had gone. The first responding officer immediately requested more units and began checking the immediate area. Christian's service weapon was still in its holster inside the vehicle, placed on the seat where he usually secured it while driving. His portable radio was still in the charging dock on the dashboard. His phone, wallet, and all his personal belongings were inside the patrol car. His jacket was on the passenger seat, and the interior heater was running at full blast. It looked as if Christian had simply stepped out of the vehicle intending to return in a few moments, except he had vanished completely. The officer circled the patrol car, searching for any clue to what had happened. He found footprints leading from the driver's door, crossing the gravel shoulder, and continuing into the desert. The prints clearly matched Christian's duty boots and showed a normal stride, with no signs of running or struggle. But 30 feet from the vehicle, the footprints simply stopped. There was no disturbance in the dirt to suggest that Christian had been lifted or dragged. The footprints did not turn in another direction or disappear onto rocky ground. They simply ended in the middle of an open space, without any explanation. As more units arrived, a systematic search was organized. K-9 teams were brought in to track Christian's scent. The dogs followed the same trail of footprints to the point where they ended. There, they became confused and started to grow restless. circling the area without being able to find any continuation of the trail. A helicopter equipped with thermal imaging flew over the area in grid patterns, covering 10 square miles around marker 247, searching for any heat signature that might indicate a person walking through the desert. They found nothing. The temperature that night had dropped to 28 degrees, cold enough that Christian would not survive long without his jacket or cold weather gear, all of which had been left inside the patrol car. The investigation expanded over the following days. Forensic technicians processed the patrol car for any evidence of a crime. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, no unknown fingerprints, and no indication that anyone besides Christian had recently been inside the vehicle. The communication system was examined to determine whether the distorted transmission could offer any clues. The audio analysis revealed something unsettling. In the background of Christian's final transmission, beneath his voice and the sounds of him leaving the vehicle, there was a high-pitched frequency that had not been audible during the live transmission but appeared clearly on the recording. The frequency was outside the normal range of human hearing and had no identifiable source. The investigation into Christian's disappearance eventually revealed a disturbing pattern. A review of Highway Patrol archives identified 3 other cases of officers who had disappeared along that same stretch of Highway 84 over the previous 30 years. In each case, the missing officer had been working alone during the night shift and had made radio transmissions indicating confusion or distress before vanishing without explanation. In 2 of the 3 previous cases, the officer's patrol car was found in the same condition as Christian's, running abandoned and without any signs of violence or struggle. Local Native American tribes in the area had oral traditions about mile marker 247, which they referred to as the place of the door. According to those traditions, there were certain points where the boundary between worlds became thin, places where things from elsewhere could cross over and where people could be taken. Tribal elders were not surprised when they heard about Christian's disappearance. They said the area around marker 247 had been avoided by their people for generations. 3 days after Christian disappeared, a long-haul truck driver came forward with information that had initially seemed too strange for him to report. He claimed he had been traveling south on Highway 84 at approximately 12:15 a.m. on the night Christian vanished. As he passed mile marker 247, he saw several bright lights in the sky above the area, lights that moved in patterns inconsistent with aircraft. At the time, he dismissed it as military activity from a nearby base, but after learning that an officer had disappeared, he felt obligated to report what he had seen. Christian was officially declared dead 7 years after his disappearance, as required by law when a person goes missing without evidence of death. His wife never remarried and spent years demanding answers about what happened to her husband. She formed a support group for families of missing officers and pushed for improved safety protocols for solo patrol assignments in remote areas. Other officers who patrol Highway 84 have reported equipment failures at mile marker 247. Radios suddenly fill with static. GPS systems lose signal. Dashboard cameras shut off without explanation. Many agents refuse to patrol that section alone at night, requesting backup even for routine stops in the area. Official policy states that there is nothing unusual about mile marker 247, but the unofficial policy among the officers themselves is very different. The dashcam recording from Christian's patrol car was recovered and analyzed frame by frame. It showed Christian getting out of the vehicle at 12:18 a.m. and walking toward the desert. In the final frames before the camera angle lost sight of him, he could be seen looking up toward the sky with an expression investigators could not fully interpret. Some described it as fear. Others said it looked more like awe. In the final frame, Christian's shadow is visible on the ground. But in the next frame, recorded 2 seconds later, the shadow is gone, even though Christian still appears partially in the image. His shadow disappeared before he did. The case remains open in the files of the New Mexico Highway Patrol. Christian's badge number has not been reassigned. His locker at the station remains untouched. His belongings are still inside exactly as he left them on his final shift. Once a year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, Officers gather at mile marker 247 to remember their missing colleague and wonder what happened to him in those final moments. The questions that tormented the dispatcher who heard his final transmission remain unanswered. What did Christian see? Where did he go? And what did he mean when he said they were taking him somewhere? The desert keeps its secrets, and mile marker 247 remains a place where the impossible has happened more than once, and where it could happen again.